first of all, say thank you to Rivka Gutman, who gave me your contact information, and it's thanks, thanks to her that you're with us today. So thank you so much, Sarah. I'm just going to say that you are a Hebrew Academy graduate, right? And you grew up in Montreal. You are now the director of Israel Guidance at Mayanot Yeshiva High School in Teaneck, New Jersey. And you teach there Talmud and contemporary Israel. And you're also pursuing doctorate in education at Yeshiva University as a Wexner Fellow and Davidson Scholar, which I have no idea what that means, but I guess it's very important. So, I'll let you now the honor of starting this year, and thank you again to all of you. Boker Tov. Let's start this Boker with Torah.
Okay, great. So hi everyone. Thank you so much, first of all, for inviting me to speak at the Kollel. It's always nice to come back and then make connections, especially to vicariously visit Montreal, because the border's been closed for a while. So it's nice to kind of come back a little bit virtually. I was saying before that it snowed. I'm in Teaneck, New Jersey right now, and it snowed this morning. So I felt that, you know, vicariously I had the Montreal experience looking out my window, which was very nice. Yeah, I'm looking forward to really learning some Torah together. So I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to share a link to a source sheet in the chat, but I'm also going to share my screen just in case you want to copy. This is copy in my drive. Oh, oops, I didn't send it to everyone. I'll send it to everyone now. Here we go. And I'm also going to share my screen. Here we go. And I have a couple of monitors going. So if it looks like I'm looking off my computer, that's just because I'm looking at the monitor. So hopefully, let me pull up the gallery. So just give me a thumbs up if people see a source sheet or no. Oh, yes. Okay, great. Perfect. So we're sharing the right screen. Awesome. Okay, so I thought what we would discuss a little bit today is connection a little bit from the Parsha. So this week's Parsha and Parshat Bo, we talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Jewish people, Am Yisrael, finally leave Mitzrayim in a very exciting night. We have the first Pesach Seder, we have Makat Becharov, plague of the firstborn, and Am Yisrael, really the Jewish people leave Egypt in kind of a great escape. Everyone's kind of taken out. And what's interesting about this narrative, you know, it's a story that we're probably pretty familiar with from the Pesach Seder, you know, and from celebrating Pesach as well, is that there's another story in Tanakh that is very, very similar to this one. It has a lot of parallels, and that's the story of Lot leaving Sodom. So what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of compare both these stories, both these narratives together. We'll see often kind of as students of Tanakh, when we see two stories in Tanakh that are so similar, it's almost asking us to put them side by side, and to look at the parallels. So we're going to compare them. We'll look for similar phrases. We're going to look for similar themes. And then the real question is, once we kind of have developed all the similarities and seen all the parallels between them, the big question is why? Why are these two stories being compared? We'll look a little bit closely to see if we can parse out what the clear differences are and the distinctions are between these two stories. And really, what's the meser, what's the lesson, and what are the takeaways that we can have? And the Tanakh is really pushing us to see by kind of framing these two stories. So here, we're actually gonna, even though it's Parshat Bo, we're gonna start by looking at the story of Lot in Sodom. And then we'll use that as a jumping off point to then compare it back to Yetziat Mitzrayim, to the night of leaving Mitzrayim. So as we go through it, I'll encourage everyone to, well, we'll try and make this as interactive as possible. But I encourage everyone, like, as we read through the story of Lot in Sodom, or Lot leaving Sodom, to really think about what in this story sounds familiar. What in this story have I seen before, or seen kind of, I guess, later on with Yetziat Mitzrayim, with leaving Mitzrayim. So here, we're going to jump kind of over here. We're going to start off a little bit just with some background of where we're at and Lot and Sodom. So maybe just to start off, to try to make this a little more interactive, can anyone just remind us, why is Lot in Sodom in Sefer Bereshit? Why does he find his way to Sodom? Anyone want to remind us? Feel free to, I guess, unmute yourself, call out. Not sure what the protocol is at Kol Torah Mitzion Shiurim. If anyone wants to share.
Abraham and Lot were together, and there wasn't enough grazing land, and so they decided to split. And and Lot left. He chose, I think, the more fertile area, and I assume that's how he ended up in Sodom.
Yeah, excellent. So yeah, thank you. That was a perfect recap. Right, so Abraham and Lot kind of split up, and Lot is drawn to Sodom. And it's interesting, we see kind of in the first source, I'll read the Hebrew, but feel free, everyone should feel free to follow along in Hebrew or in English, whatever you're most comfortable with, right? That when Lot sees, he raises his eyes, and he sees what draws him a little bit to Sodom is like that it's described, Kigan Hashem, Ke'eretz Mitzrayim, that it's as fertile as the land of Egypt. But already we see kind of this parallel of Sodom and Mitzrayim being kind of compared. And it's interesting to kind of delve into that a little bit further in the next two sources. We see that Sodom and Mitzrayim are also compared a little bit as places of injustice that are almost crying out with their injustice and require the intervention of God. We see kind of in Bereshit, in Perek Yud in source 2, right? This is after Abraham's big negotiation, right? With, or actually, sorry, right before, right, the negotiation. Vayomer Hashem zakat sdom v'amora ki rabah v'chatatam ki kavdal ma'od. That like God says there's this za'akah, there's this kind of outrage that's happened kind of from what's going on in Sodom. Erdana ve'ereh, that God himself is going to descend to check it out. Let's see what's going on in Sodom. Let's see what this injustice is. And we see a little bit of this parallel kind of in Shmot, with not so much a za'aka, but a tza'aka, that the same thing with Moshe and Hashem kind of having this dialogue that Hashem tells Moshe, right, the same idea, where, oh, ra'iti it's ani ami, God has seen the suffering of the Jewish people, we'll skip ahead a little bit, ve'etza katan shamati, then he's heard their outcry, and again, in Pasuk Ched, in verse 8, ve'ered lahatzilo, God is going to go down to intervene. So again, kind of this juxtaposition of Sodom and Mitzrayim as places of injustice. So that's just kind of like by way of introduction, setting this up before we get to the real kind of, I would say, like meat and potatoes of the narrative, which is Bereshit Yotet. So first of all, I just want to, before we continue, a lot of the ideas I'm going to share today are not really my own. We'll just skip ahead a little bit without giving away too many spoilers. I put some like further reading at the end. So a lot of these ideas from Rav Yoel Ben Nun, Rav Menachem Littag, Rav Chana Waxman, all teachers at Yeshivat Har Tzion in Israel. So everyone should feel free to kind of explore these ideas more after the shiur, if you're interested in them. So again, just to kind of say where a lot of these ideas came from. I'm going to skip back now to where we are. Okay, and great. That was like my plug for those for further study. Okay, so right now we find ourselves, Lot's been in Sodom for a while. He's moved his family there. He's raised his family there. But God and Abraham, after a certain amount of negotiation, have decided, it's been decided that Lot and his family will be saved, but everyone else is going to be destroyed. So God sends the two malachim, two angels, in disguise, undercover, to go and really extricate and take Lot out from Sodom. So we'll read the story together. This is Bereshit Perek Yotet. We're starting here with source number 4. And again, as we read through this great escape from Sodom, I want to invite everyone to reflect and to think what parts of this story sound like what happens at the Pesach Seder, what happens when Am Yisrael leaves Mitzrayim, which we see in this week's Parsha and Parsha Bo. So I'll read and kind of explain. We'll just summarize the story a little bit together, and then we'll kind of open it up to reflections and questions and ideas from all of us in the group to see kind of what parallels we can come up with, and then we'll look at the text in Parshat Bo. Okay, so let's start reading together. So I'm going to read the Hebrew, but please feel free to follow along in whatever you're most comfortable in. Okay, so the story starts off. We're not going to read the whole thing. We'll skip kind of to get the main idea. But in Pasuk Aleph, Vayevo shnei melachim stoma ba'erev. So the two melachim come to Sodom at night. You can see there's lots of colors. We'll talk about the colors after. That just kind of to color code a lot of the words we're going to see are parallel in both the stories. Lot Yoshev b'shar Sodom, and Lot is kind of sitting by the gate in Sodom. He sees the two melachim, and he as a good nephew of Avraham Avinu, trained in hospitality, he invites them to his home. In Pasuk Bet, Vayomer hinena. Adoni surunal Beit avatchem, please come to the house of your servant. Belinu v'rachzu raglechem v'hishkamtem v'halatem l'darchechem v'yamru lo ki b'rachov nalin. So Lot invites them, please come to my house. I'll take care of you. I'll feed you. But the Melachim say, no, we're good. We're gonna stay on the streets. But in Pasuk Gimel, Lot really pushes them. Vayiftzar ba me'od, vayisuru olav, vayivo el beito. And they come to his house. He makes a feast. Vayas lahem mishteh. And interesting, what do they serve at this feast? Umatzot afa vayechelu. That they actually eat matzah at this feast. And it's interesting. We'll skip. We're gonna come back in a second. If you look at source 5, Rashi on this place actually says, oh, why did Lot bake matzah for his guests? It was Pesach. So obviously a lot we won't go into too much depth here, but a lot to think about, right? How could there be Pesach before Matan Torah, right? Lots of questions, theological questions there. But perhaps just the simplest answer is Rashi is just drawing us already to this connection, to this Pesach connection that we see, or that we're going to see between these two stories. So let's go back up. And now we're going to the next page. Okay, so Lot has these guests. He thinks everything's going to be fine. But then a mob of people in stone come to his house and surround the door. So this is Pasuk Dalet, Ter Mishkavu, Banshei Ha'ir, Anshe Stone, Nasovu al Habayit, Minar Vadzaken, Kol Ha'am Mikatzeh. So the entire kind of, a huge mob from the town comes and surrounds the Bayit, surrounds Lot's house. They yell out to Lot in Pasuk Hey, Vaikru Lot Vayomer Lo, where are the guests that came to your home? Throw them out to us. And again, they actually threaten sexual assaults, and we're going to assault them. Throw your guests out of the house. And again, something very, very shocking to kind of read, showing again kind of the depravity of what's been happening in Sodom. And Pasuk Vav, Lot goes out and he closes the door behind him. And he tries to speak to the crowd in Pasuk Zion. He says, please don't hurt them, my brothers, don't do this. In Pasuk Chet, he actually makes a very bizarre kind of compromise is suggested. And he says, Hinen na li shtei banot asher lo yadu ish, otziya na eten alechem ve'asu lahen katol be'inechem rak la'anashim ha'el al tasu davar ki al ken ba'u b'tzel korati. Very, very shocking. Lot says, do not harm my guests. They've come under my protection. I have 2 young daughters, never been married. I'm going to throw them out to you. You, the crowd, can do to them whatever you want. Just don't hurt my guests. So we get a very bizarre, very warped, very shocking kind of version of hospitality here, where he's willing to sacrifice his daughters for the safety of the guests. And we'll unpack that a little bit more a little bit later. And again, the Pasuk Tet, the crowd does not care, and they kind of insult Lot, and they say, "Ha'echad balagor v'yishvot shafot atana ra'lecha mehem." That you came here as a foreigner. You're not a citizen of Sodom. You don't really live here, and now you're going to judge us. We're gonna get you worse than we get them. At this point, luckily, the Malachim decide that it's time to intervene and maybe reveal their secret powers a little bit to try to solve what's been going on. Things have been getting a little bit out of control. Right in Pasuk Tet, everyone is trying to break down the door. So in Pasuk Yud, the Anashim, right, which are really secretly the Melachim, kind of put their, I was reading in Hebrew in Pasuk Tet, Vayishlachu Anashim et Yadam, Vayiviu et Lot Alehem Habaita V'Tedelet Sagru. The angels kind of bring Lot in, they close the door. V'Tanashim Asher Petach Habayit Hiku B'Sanverim, Mikaton V'Gadol, Vayalulim So HaPetach. And they smite everyone outside with blindness, sounds like. And all of a sudden you have this situation where everyone outside is kind of affected by this plague, this illness, right, of blindness. They can't find the door, but anyone who's kind of like in this house with the Melachim or the Anashim is saved, is protected. Okay, and then Pasuk Bet, the Anashim kind of revealed to Lot, listen, here's the deal. We're God's destroying Sodom very, very soon. We're here to get your family out, get everyone together, and we got to go. And they explain this kind of in Pasuk Gimel, Ki mashchitim anachnu et hamakom hazeh, ki gadlat sakatam et pnei Hashem. That this place is going to be destroyed. We have to get out of here. And then we're almost done with the story. In Pasuk Yudalad, it's kind of a very sad, a little bit of an ending. Lot goes to his son-in-law, so I guess he had 2 older daughters, perhaps, or 2 other daughters. Excuse me. And he tries to talk to them. And Pasuk Yudalad, he says, Kumutz umin hamakom hazeh, we got to get out of here. At the end of Pasuk 14, Pasuk Yudalad, he's seen as like a laughing stock in front of his son-in-laws. They don't take him seriously. Like, really, this is going to happen? No, like we're not leaving with you. That's not going to happen. You see in Pasuk Tet Zayin, Pasuk Tet Zayin. Oh, sorry, I think I skipped something. Yeah, Pasuk Tet Vav. It gets a little bit. Finally, it's getting closer to dawn. Kmo hashachar alav vayitzu hamalachim balot lemor kum kachad ishtecha v'shnei benotecha hanimsaot pen tisafeh ba'alvon ha'ir. The malachim say it's time to go, and pushing him, grab your wife, your two other daughters. We're just going to go. Pasuk Tet Zayin, vayit mamea. They delay. They don't want to leave. They don't want to leave Stom. Vayichzku anashim biyado. They physically grab Lot by his hands and by his wife's hands and his daughters, and they kind of like pull them out of the city and kind of drop them off outside the city. There's kind of just like they rush them out and kind of have to drag them out of Stom. And then there's a final kind of discussion in Pasuk Yud Chet where Lot basically turns to the Malachim and says, we can't make it to the mountain where they're supposed to escape to. It's too far. There's a small city called Soar that's right here. It's supposed to be destroyed. Can just not be destroyed. And we're going to go there. And the Malachim are kind of like, feel like a little bit exasperated at this point with Lot, but they're like, fine, you'll go to Soar. And that's it. And then the last kind of, right, that was kind of over here, right? Chafbet, they tell him, Maher, like, fine, if you're going to go to Zohar, you got to go fast, you got to move. And then the final Sukkim, Kafhe and Kafav, the city is destroyed, Stom is destroyed. And as famously we're told, Batebet Ishtom Acharav, Lot's wife, cannot resist looking back as the city is destroyed. Batehina Tziv Melach, and she becomes a pillar of salt. And then there's kind of like, again, a very disturbing ending, right? Which I didn't put in the source sheet, right? But Lot and his two daughters go to a cave. They think that no one else is around. There's like an incestuous act that happens. And then two more nations are born of Ammon and Moab. So a lot to unpack kind of in this story. I've been talking for a while, so I would love to kind of hear people's thoughts and reactions. And again, as we said, we haven't looked at the text in Parshat Bo yet, but I'm very curious to hear what have people noticed that sounds similar from the story of Lot to the story of leaving Mitzrayim. Any similar themes, words, locations, scenes? I'd love to hear what people think. So feel free to, yeah.
Well, the door being a symbol of somehow being protective of the people inside. That's one, and the hurriedness of everything. Everything's in a hurry.
Yeah, excellent. Definitely a lot of. Sorry, yeah, go on.
Yeah, just those two things struck me.
Great. So I'd say, right, exactly. The kind of a lot of the focus on the bayit, the delet, right, as like protection, which we definitely are going to see a little bit in Makab Bechorot, right? The Jewish people stay inside. You stay inside, you're safe. You go outside, there's danger. And like this rushedness, right, that we see also in Yetziat Mitzrayim, the chipazon, with which we are rushed out of Mitzrayim, for sure. Any other similarities people see?
What about also the disbelief, not believing of what's about to occur, which is on the part of Paro, not believing and always disputing what is about to happen.
For sure. No, I think that's a great parallel also, right? Both with Lot a little bit, and definitely with his son-in-laws, right? This idea that no, like, how do we know this is going to happen? Prove this to me. We're not interested in kind of making changes. Definitely. Anyone else? Feel free to call out. People have any thoughts, any similarities that we see? I don't know if that's someone answering. It's hard to hear. But. They tell us in education school you're supposed to wait, give people wait time, so people can think about their answers. Maybe we'll give it another few seconds if anyone else has any ideas they'd like to share. Well, if anyone does, feel free to call out. Feel free to share. You can post the chat.
Miriam spoke about Paro, who didn't want to go. But the Jews themselves, the Jews themselves didn't believe, and they didn't want to leave Egypt. And here also it says that they had to take them by force because the Jews themselves were not in that case. Lot and his daughters themselves, they didn't want to go. So it's kind of it's very close to the Yetziat Mitzrayim, where the Jews also did not believe and were very happy with staying in Egypt, even though they had all these, you know, they were slaves, but they still wanted the known, something that is already, you know, they know it.
Yeah, no, nachon. I think that's definitely true, and I think that's something we'll talk a little bit about towards the end of the shiur. Like, what happens when you have a group of people that are being taken out of a terrible situation, but they don't exactly want to leave, right? And how perhaps, right, even if it doesn't work with Lot, what are some of the changes we could make to make sure it is successful when Am Yisrael try to leave Mitzrayim? So yeah, excellent. Okay, so thank you everyone for your comments. If people have more comments, please feel free.
I have one more just about the plagues, because I was just reading now, you have the rain and then the fire and brimstone that could be compared to a couple of the plagues as well.
For sure, right? Definitely, I would say not just the verb of mashchit, right, of like kind of destroying, but definitely that idea also, right, of like the hail sounds very much like what's going on with stone, right? Almost like a plague that's of destruction that's happening, and not just that's one example. Also, kind of like what happens when everyone is kind of struck with blindness outside as well. Yeah, so thank you. That's great. So I made a little bit of a cheat sheet, which is helpful to see the parallels. I didn't want to say it before, but we'll come back to the story in Bo in Parsha Bo in a second. But if you look to I believe this is the last page. Yeah, there we go. The last page of the source sheet, I just kind of gave a lot of the parallels to kind of look at, many of which people kind of shared already. Right, we have lots of similar words that are kind of happening in both, as people pointed out. Right, a lot of focus around the bayit, ideas of kind of like yatsa, yetziah, taking people out, tzaka, mashchitim, for sure, and just some of the thematic parallels we saw. Also, I think on a minute level, right, with Lot, you have that whole showdown with the mob, right, where you have the situation where Lot and his guests are safe when they're inside the house, and there's danger outside the house. And we're going to see also with Makat Bechorot that same idea, that as long as you stay in the house on the night of Makat Bechorot, you know, we'll talk about putting blood on the doorpost, there's protection for you, like as part of Am Yisrael. God will protect you kind of from what's happening with Makat Bechorot. But if you go outside, there's danger, right? Sounds eerily a little bit similar to perhaps a Corona lockdown, right? But the same idea of kind of like being protected when you're inside, and this idea of danger on the outside. Both of the stories happen at night. We'll see also, and again, and the leaving kind of takes place around daybreak in both of those stories. And again, as people pointed out, exactly, there's a lot of this idea of chipazon, of being rushed out, Lot being rushed out, the Jewish people being rushed out, and this idea of not wanting to leave with Lot. You know, he definitely doesn't really want to leave, but he can be convinced. His son-in-laws don't leave, his wife turns back, and kind of really this ambivalence of being taken out. And we're going to look at some psukim after Parshat Bo that show that you know, there's different traditions about the Jews in Mitzrayim. How assimilated were they, and how much did they actually want to leave or not want to leave? And we'll come back to the differences again after that. Also, just one of the things like this revolves around a family being saved. Yetziat Mitzrayim is kind of many families of the Jewish people being saved. So we'll come back to many of these parallels. So let's go back now with the time that we have left. And sorry, I went a little bit too far. We are going to look now at Parshat Bo. We'll actually start a little bit earlier over here. We're going to look at Shemot Perek Yud Bet, and we'll see a little bit, we'll jump around a little bit, but we'll see kind of some of the text, some of the narrative of Am Yisrael leaving Egypt, and just see if we can sharpen some of these parallels, and then we'll talk about the differences as we get to the takeaways. So here what's interesting is, before we're even told about kind of like what's going to be the procedure for the Jewish people leaving Mitzrayim that night, Am Yisrael were given a certain amount of mitzvot to do kind of in preparation of leaving Mitzrayim. So we see this at the beginning of Perek Yud Bet, source number 6, Pasuk Bet. We start off already, the Jews are given the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh, Rosh Chodesh Hazel Lachem, Rosh Chodeshim. They're given the mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh. And right after that, Pasuk Gimel, they're told that everyone needs to take a seh. Everyone needs to take a lamb, which is going to kind of serve as the very first Korban Pesach. And they're supposed to take it a few days in advance of the actual date of what's going to be the very first Pesach Seder. I think they take it right in Pasuk Gimel. Everyone's going to take a seh, and they're going to take it, you know, on the 10th of Nisan, and they're going to keep it around till the 14th. So kind of like a public showing of the seh, which will be sacrificed. Then, as we know, Pasuk Zion, after the Korban Pasach will be sacrificed, the very first Pasach Seder ever, they're going to take the blood and they're going to put on the mashkof, right of the delet, actually right behind me, you can see the door. You're going to put it right on all corners of the door. So they're given that command as well. And then in Pasuk Tet, they're actually told specifically how to eat the Korban Pasach, right? Not just that you're going to be eating it later on, right? This idea of the Pasach Seder with matzah and maror, but here that you're not allowed. We'll just read the Pasuk Tet. Al tachlu mimenu na uvashel mevushal b'mayim ki'im tzli eish risho al kravav ve'al korvo. That it's not supposed to be like lamb chillent, right? You have to keep it kind of so you can still see the sheep. You have to roast it. So it has to be something where the shape of the sheep is going to be very visible. And again, and finally, Pasuk Yud Aleph, they're told the dress code for the very first Pasach Seder, that they have to dress ready to go, right? Matnechem, chagurim, nalachem, bereglechem, shoes on, belts tightened, your stick in your hand, and you're ready to go. So just interesting, we'll talk about this at the end, that we start off with these commands that Am Yisrael is given in preparation of leaving. Right, the idea that they're right, b'chipazon pasachu la'Hashem, because you're going to be leaving very quickly. And then God kind of explains why all this is going to happen. That night, there's going to be makat bechorot, right? Avarti be'eretz Mitzrayim b'layla hazeh v'hiketi kol bechor be'eretz Mitzrayim. So similar language that we saw before with Lot, right? It's happening at night. The idea of smiting, right? That God is smiting them. You have to put the blood as on the batim, right? The same focus on the houses. Asher, this is Pasuk Yud Gimel, Asher Tem Sham v'ra'iti et hadamu pasati alechem. And if God sees the blood, he will either pass over or kind of hover over to protect, depending on how you want to translate it, to protect the Jews who are in that house. And no one will come to destroy you. It then kind of goes on, Pasuk Chaf Bet, we'll skip down a little bit, and it actually adds on that Am Yisrael is not allowed to leave their homes that night. It's a lockdown, maybe a little bit more security than kind of the lockdowns that happen now. But again, this idea that, not just that you're putting the blood on the doors, but atem lo titzu ish mipatach beito ad boker, in Pasuk Chaf Bet, in Pasuk 22, you cannot go outside until the morning. You are only safe if you are going to be inside. And as long as everything's again on the house, in Pasuk Chaf Gimel, lo yitena mashchit lavo batechem lingov, you will be protected. And then it goes on, as we know, that night is Makat Bechorot, all of firstborns in Egypt die and are killed. And then Pasuk Lamed Aleph, Paro in the middle of the night goes to Moshe and Aaron and says, Kumu tseu mitoch ami, get out of my nation. I want you guys out right now. Get everything, take everything and go. And not just kind of like Paro trying to kind of rush them out, but in Pasuk Lamed Gimel, and 33, the entire Egyptian people is like, get these Jews out of here. They think the death is not gonna stop until Am Yisrael is finally out, and they're rushing them out. And finally, most famously, we know in Pasuk Lamed Tet, this is one of the reasons given for matzah, because the Jews were rushed out so quickly that the matzah didn't have time to rise. Lo yachlu lehitzmamea, right? Again, that they couldn't delay. We saw that word with Lot when he wanted to delay as well. They didn't have time to make everything. And that kind of finishes off this story. So interesting again, kind of, I think we just see a lot of those parallels. I'm wondering if anyone wants to share like any new thoughts or any kind of ideas that came up, and maybe even any differences. We spoke a lot about the similarities between the two stories. And I'm curious now if people are starting to notice maybe, well, what are some of the big differences between what happens with Lot and Sodom and what happens with the Jewish people in Mitzrayim?
I was thinking of the agents who are taking them out. On the one hand, you have the Malachim, and who are agents of God, or maybe even, and on the other hand, you have Moshe and Aharon. I don't know if you have anything to comment on that, similarities or differences in that.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think that's a really interesting parallel for sure. That, like, again, this idea of like two agents that are being used, two shlichim, right, in both cases to take people out. So yeah, I think that's a great parallel, for sure. Anyone else, thoughts, reactions? What maybe are some of the differences that come out between these stories?
Maybe possibly the fact that the blood that they used to protect themselves during Sodom, it's maybe the blood of his daughters, because they were, they had not known any men, and he sent the women out So maybe it's the difference is that we learn from that, and during Mitzrayim, we didn't offer our daughters. There was blood to protect them.
Interesting. So almost just to make sure I understand you, that like it's almost like a metaphorical, right? That kind of like he's offering out kind of like, you know, the blood of his daughters, and kind of physically here, kind of putting blood on the doors.
Yeah,
it's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting idea. You know, that they're definitely by Pesach talks about kind of like the blood, you know, of whether it's of Brit Milah, of Korban Pesach, that are kind of used as like the zchut, the merit for Am Yisrael to leave. So definitely kind of, again, a lot of that imagery that's going on. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And anyone else, any other thoughts?
The Korban Pesach, they couldn't clean the inside of the animal. They had to eat everything. Even
I guess they could clean. I think it was more that they wanted, and I'll talk about this now, but they didn't want it. They wanted people to know that, or I guess Hashem wanted it to be public that Am Yisrael was like eating the seh, like eating the lamb, that they didn't want it. They wanted it kind of roasted on the spit a little bit, versus, you know, I'm not enough of an expert in, I don't know if anyone's doing Daf Yomi and knows a little more about Psachim, but like I'm not an expert in kind of what was going on inside the animal. But definitely, I think the main idea was that they wanted to keep it set up so you're able to see it. But we'll come back to that point. It's a good question. So if anyone else has thoughts, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I'll point out a few differences and takeaways as we kind of wrap up this morning. That I'm happy to hear. I would love to hear more reflections that people have. So again, I think that, you know, when we think about the parallels, I want to come back to one of the parallels that Sarah Gatino kind of mentioned before, right? That maybe Am Yisrael, maybe the Jewish people didn't really want to leave Egypt. You know, like how much was there of like taking people out, you know, of Lot maybe not wanting to leave? How much did Am Yisrael want to leave? So it's interesting because I think we have different traditions when it comes to how ready Am Yisrael was to leave Mitzrayim, right? There's the famous kind of tradition that, you know, when they stayed in Mitzrayim, they didn't change their names, they didn't change their clothing, they didn't change, you know, their culture. But at the same time, it's interesting if we look at Yechezkel, was one of the later Nevi'im, the later prophets, and it talks a little bit about like kind of talks a little bit about what happened during the time of Mitzrayim. Here we'll just look at Pasuk Zayin. It actually seems to imply that Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, were somewhat assimilated, were somewhat kind of enmeshed in Egyptian culture. And it says over here, right, Yomar Alehem ish could say enav hishlichu b'gilulei Mitzrayim al titamu, and Pasuk Zayin, that we should cast away like the abominations of Egypt, the idols of Egypt. And again in Pasuk Chet, right, v'gilulei Mitzrayim lo azavu, that Am Yisrael, God was telling us in Egypt to kind of put away our Egyptian idols, our connection to Egyptian culture, but we didn't. So it's an interesting question to kind of think about that, you know, similar to what we see with Lot went to Sodom, you know, a little bit, I guess, more with good intentions or positive intentions perhaps, but he and his family become very, very enmeshed in the culture to the extent that, you know, it's just almost tragic to see how Lot can't even get most of his family to leave. And I think the most disturbing aspect of that story, where he offers his daughters to the mob, is really almost a bizarre, warped and twisted version of Hakmasat Orchim, of hospitality. And Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham, where he had learned all about hospitality, just the values of Sodom had changed him, had warped that to the extent that he's willing to sacrifice his daughters again, and this is not a way to do hospitality or solve this problem, but how Sodom had kind of changed him. And I think the big question also is going to be that the Jewish people, after hundreds of years of slavery in Egypt, and you could call it Stockholm Syndrome, you could call it many different things, but as much maybe as they were ready to go, they also had really been influenced by Egyptian culture. And the big question here is how, when we take the Am Yisrael, this is, you know, people talk about this a lot, the Seder, you know, you could take the Jews out of Egypt. How do you take Egypt out of the Jews? You know, and how do we make sure the Jewish people are able to really break with that culture? And this is where I think we get to some of the differences. And I wanted to share, you know, we spoke about all the parallels, and I think we really developed the parallels of both these stories. And I wanted to share kind of two takeaways of why are these stories being compared? What are our takeaways, and what's the messer? What's the lesson as we wrap up this morning? So I think one idea over here of kind of why these two stories are being compared. This is brought up by Rabbi Yoel ben Nun. He speaks a little bit about this, that perhaps kind of in the story of Lot is a microcosm of kind of the telling of the Jews coming out of Egypt. that the story of Lot leaving Sodom is kind of one family being saved, and half a family, right? They don't all get out, but once Lot and his family is kind of taken out of this place and is saved, and you have almost this exodus, we said there's that very strange scene at the end where Lot and his daughters are in the cave. The daughters think there's no one else left in the world. They start an incestuous kind of affair with their father, and 2 new nations are born, Ammon and Moab, in a very kind of strange telling of events. And perhaps there, a family is taken out, and even though it's super strange, like nations are born. What happens in Mitzrayim? All the families are taken out, and the nation of the Jewish people is really born. So perhaps it's like a microcosm in one story, and then we see kind of how that's developed for like the larger Jewish people in Sefer Shemot, in Parshat Bo. So that's one idea. I want to kind of go in a different direction, and I think the different direction, which will kind of be the final idea that I'll share today, is I think we have a big question when we think about what happened with Lot. Lot, I think we can kind of characterize that story as a failed exodus, as a failed escape, right? Ideally, Lot's entire family would have been willing to leave. They would have been willing to leave with the Melachim, and everything would have been fine. But what do we see? As I mentioned before, we see the warped influence of Sodom on Lot, that he has this, offering his daughters this bizarre version, twisted version of Hakmasat Orchim, of saving his guests, which is wildly inappropriate, if not criminal. Then we see how his son-in-laws laugh at him. His wife isn't even able to turn herself away. And even with his daughter's behavior kind of at the end, how much of that also was influenced by Sodom. And really you have Lot kind of almost by himself, like a broken man, that it's almost just depressing, the end of the story, that he went to Sodom and look what ends up happening. Look at kind of what's lost. And I think the big question when we get to Sefer Shemot, when we get to Parshat Bo, is we are about to do the exact same thing. We are about to try to take not just a person this time or a family, but entire people that have been in a dominant culture for hundreds of years that, yes, has oppressed them, but has also not been a culture full of the most positive values. And how are we now going to get them out of Egypt without it also being a fail, without it also kind of falling into the same pitfalls that we had with Lot? And I think the biggest difference that we see here was when we started our story in Parshat Bo, or at least here in Shemot Perek Yud, we start off with Am Yisrael being given mitzvot. And I think this is kind of, we could look at the psychology of this as well, but here Am Yisrael is invited almost by God to participate in their own redemption. It's not as much as, we say like Hashem took them out with his hand and, and was extremely active and did almost all of the work, right, for sure. Am Yisrael still have to participate by doing certain mitzvot. And it's interesting, if we think about the mitzvot they were given, all of these mitzvot are ways to break with Egyptian culture. Rabbi Menachem Litai talks a lot about this. I'll just point out a few things. Like if you think about it, even Rosh Chodesh, right, is this idea, the first mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh is saying that we're going to go by a lunar calendar, right? And we know in Egypt, there was a lot of sun worship, right? Everything kind of worship, focused around the sun. So already we're kind of breaking from that. And then you think about the very first Seder that's going to happen that night in Mitzrayim. Whether it's, the maror, whether it's, the matzah, which, symbolized like what they ate as slaves. But more specifically, we know the seh, the lamb, right, was one of the Egyptian gods. And you almost have to have it on display for a few days before you then physically shecht it and eat it. And not just that, but as people pointed out, right, in the shiur, right, we're talking about this earlier, right, that like you have to kind of keep it on the spit. Like we want everyone to see, you can't hide that you were doing this. This has to be a public stance that you are taking, that you are basically not afraid of the Egyptian god, and you are going to kind of roast it. And all of these, I think, are actions, and it's talked about kind of in psychology, like the more, right, you kind of do certain actions, the more you're going to believe it, the more you're going to be invested in it. These are all actions to make sure that Am Yisrael is successful at leaving Egypt when Lot has failed. And finally, just point out, skip down a little bit. And the final thing, which I think is just like a nice idea, the Ibn Ezra, in his commentary on why they had to put the blood on the doors, he actually points out that, you might have thought the blood on the doors was for the Egyptians a little bit. Like we want to kind of show the Egyptians, look what we're doing to your God, we're not afraid of it. But he actually points out a problem with that. And he says, I'm going to skip to the second underline, the ilu haya ken, if this was true, ilu haya ken hayaze b'shar hachatzer, v'hine lo husham hadam ki'im beseter, shesagru sha'ar hachatzer. that really points out that it wasn't really for the Egyptians, because people kind of had their door, then they kind of had their walkway, and they had a courtyard. So if it was really for, you know, the Egyptians to see, you would have to put the blood on like the outside courtyard. So why are you putting it kind of on a door where maybe the Egyptians aren't seeing it so much? His reason is rakatam liot hadam al mashkov liot kofer be'ad kol chalabait. That it was supposed to be almost like an absolution, an atonement for everyone living in the house. But with permission of the Ibn Ezra, I'd like to extend that a little bit, that perhaps what it's saying is the mitzvot that the Jewish people were doing that night, it wasn't just kind of for the Egyptians, but more importantly, it was really for them. Like the blood on the door, it wasn't for the Egyptians to see this and to show that the Jewish people like aren't afraid of the Egyptians, but maybe it was an internal breaking with Egyptian culture, that like, we're going to put this blood on the door and it doesn't matter who else sees it, but we need to see it. We need to see that we're breaking with Egyptian culture, that what Lot was unable to do with stone, we are going to attempt to do here, whether it's through our Seder, whether it's through, you know, what we're doing with the Korban, whether it's what we're doing with Rosh Chodesh. It's interesting, Rabbi Liebtag points out also that even the theme of the very first Pesach Seder of eating the bread, sorry, not bread, the fact that you can't have bread, that you are, chametz is forbidden and you're eating matzah, and you can't have any leaven, that really bread and beer were like the staples of an Egyptian diet. So to kind of ban that food at your meal is you're almost having the theme of your dinner be anti-Egyptian. I put some pictures over here of kind of like, you can just Google Egypt bread and beer and you'll see it come up kind of in a huge amount of posts. The same idea, kind of breaking with it. And I think that one of these takeaways could be, even though we know, not to, you know, spoiler alert, but I think we know how Chumash ends, that this generation, as much as they tried and Moshe tried, is never really able to break free of Mitzrayim. They end up dying in the desert, and it's only their children that go into Eretz Yisrael. There was really a strong attempt that they should be successful, that where Lot failed, the Jewish people would be able to succeed. And I think a big part of it is because they do those mitzvot. I think it's perhaps a fitting messer, a fitting lesson for us today. You know, all of us kind of struggling a little bit with the challenges of Corona, the challenges of being kept indoors, perhaps, you know, with our families or away from our families, but again, being kind of trapped indoors, and to think maybe there's some you know, chizuk, some encouragement we can take a little bit from this story, that, you know, it's the focus kind of on Pesach, or the focus of the Jewish people being redeemed, were on the mitzvot they were able to do in their home, and what they were able to do in the Beit to really kind of break from what was going on outside. And perhaps for us today, to as we look for the silver linings and we look for the you know, the opportunities in the challenges of times of Corona, to think about what could we do while we're, you know, trapped in our homes, to kind of focus on what are the values that are important to us, what are the values that are important to our families, the mitzvot that are important to us, and kind of creating kind of our own kind of culture, our own kind of bubble within our homes, and using that opportunity until the time when we're able to again kind of mix freely. So again, a lot to unpack, a lot to think about. That's kind of my main idea, and I'd love to, and thank you again for inviting me. It's been a pleasure really learning with everyone, and I'd love to hear if anyone has kind of final thoughts or reactions or anything to kind of build off some of these ideas. It's also okay if not, but if anyone has any reactions, any other thoughts about kind of some of the differences, I'd like to hear them.
I would like just to say amazing shiur, amazing shiur, Sarah. You've opened my eyes to concepts that I never knew. Just beautiful. I have one question though, just to go back, because of Rashi who talked about Lot making the matzah, the unleavened bread. Do you have any thoughts on that? Anything that you want to add?
It's an interesting question. It's a big debate in the Mefarshim, right? That, you know, whether, you know, were there mitzvot before the giving of a Torah, were there not mitzvot before the giving of a Torah, were there perhaps just ethical mitzvot before the Torah and then the religious ones came later? So I don't have like an answer like on one foot, you know. I think that it's a big debate in the commentaries and in the Mefarshim. Here, I think the easiest way to deal with Rashi is that he is, you know, you can either take that approach that maybe there, you know, like there were all the mitzvot before the Torah, but I think that it's more that Rashi is kind of just pointing out that connection, you know, that like, what does it mean that it was Pesach? again, you talked to Rashi what he really meant, but I think it could be this idea that it's just, again, establishing that connection, you know, like, was it really Pesach, or is Rashi kind of leading us to look at the Pesach story because there's so many themes, if that makes sense.
Sarah, I have one question I wanted to, or just one point. The parallel between Lot's wife looking back, the minute she looked back, she turns to salt. In other words, she gets stuck. Whereas in leaving, you know, the people wanting to leave Egypt, not necessarily wanting to, but we're told that they shouldn't be looking back. They should not want to go back. They shouldn't go back, because if you go back, you're gonna be, you know, totaled. So there's that parallel also, you know, with looking back.
No, I never thought that. That's a great idea as well, right? You can even think about, right, next week's 2 weeks parsha, right, in Beshalach, when God takes Am Yisrael out, like, we go the long way, right, because we're almost afraid that people are going to run back.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think it's a really interesting parallel to think about, for sure.
Thank you. And by the way, I'm also shipping nachas, you know, from you and from your mom. I'm very proud of your daughter, Heather. It's beautiful to see this. Really. Yeah. Continue from strength to strength.
Thank you. Great. Okay. If anyone has any other final thoughts, otherwise I'll turn it back to the kollel, and it's a pleasure learning Torah with everyone. And you know, I know that I think Montreal's on a stricter lockdown right now than the United States, but wishing everyone you know, a safe lockdown and everything.
Thank you.
Wow, what a beautiful shiur. Thank you so
Beautiful
much.
shiur, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Have
much,
a great day,
Sarah.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Everyone have a great week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Mhm.